Joe Troyer from Speedway High School. I'm the chair of the Broadcasting Committee. With me, as always, is this is Eddie Small from Rushville, who's also on the Broadcasting Committee. And what our intent here is to facilitate kind of a discussion and get some ideas from the group that's here about different issues with the broadcasting event. For those of you who attended Chris Lowry's session on what's going to be happening with events and whether we end up adding employee and info and whether we combine or condense some of our other offerings to compensate, radio is one of those events that's in the discussion. So I think it behooves us at this time to talk about what we feel like is important for the event going forward, because the board, when they make their considerations, moving forward is going to be a big part of whether the event survives and in what form it's going to be. So, here's some ideas for discussion, and we're going to kind of check these off one at a time. I think you probably will sort of gravitate toward each other a little more as we go on, because what I'm hoping we do is I'd like to present some ideas, and then I'd like for us to discuss a little bit in small groups to kind of facilitate, getting ideas out there. And Eddie and I are going to do our level best to record what is said here, and then that'll be part of the board's consideration going forward. So, some of the things that are important not for discussion, for broadcasting, for discussion about broadcasting, I should put up there, I guess. First, we want to think about the current sectional and state competition model as it exists. Meaning the rounds and what we ask the kids to do in those rounds. And the contrast to what a lot of schools are doing in their regular season meets, both procedurally and the tasks that we're asking the students to complete. And then more generally, just what are the tasks and skills that we're asking the kids to demonstrate as part of the performance, and are we asking them the right things? Should we be doing something different? And so on. I'd also like to get a gauge on what you all think about the importance of prepping and writing on site versus prepping and writing and bringing something with you to the tournament. Doubling is the forever issue with radio when it comes to sectionals and state, and a lot of the impetus for this session centers around whether we're going to allow radio to double or not. So that's important for us to talk about. And then those of you who were here yesterday when Mr. McKenzie was talking in the business meeting, you might have heard him mention the actual amount of time that a radio competitor actually spends saying words out loud at a tournament versus what we do in other events. So, any questions about any of this before we get rolling? Very well. So, first thing I'd like you to do is, we can be loose with this. If you don't want to do the small group, report to the large group. If we just want to do, we've got kind of a small group anyway. I guess these are three things that occurred to me that would be useful to know in terms of like baselines. Where are we at, or what are people doing around the state? So, what rounds are held in your area? So, in other words, are you doing like newscast, commercial, editorial, OTS? Is that what everybody does in your area, or are people throwing breaking news in there? Are they doing, or doing their own thing, or whatever? Do tournaments let the radio kids double in your area? And then what do you like or not like about how radios run at the regular season tournaments? So, ideas, comments? Yes, Wally.
Down south, we do a news brief first round, that's prepared in advance. So
Okay.
students prepare that news brief, so there's no prep time. required. And then by the second round, we put in the prep time for, the commercial and the editorial third round. And then the fourth round is typically on the spot. Again, very short prep, very short speaking time. And we do allow doubling.
Do you go over to, have you been able to get over to Evansville at all? I don't know.
Yes,
if
yes,
anybody-
yes.
What do they,
That's typically what they're doing at their schools as well.
and are you guys asking them to write for their editorial or sight read?
They're given 30-minute prep time, and they're given material that, pro-com essentially, and then they have to develop their own case.
Similar to
stand.
state.
Yes,
Similar
we
to
try to
state.
model the invitationals, given time constraints as much as possible, but also allow some flexibility for doubling.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
At the Cheshire tournament, I tried to follow the state sort of order, and of course we didn't do as many rounds, but I picked 4 of the rounds and tried to do it in that order as it was done. So
Were you deliberate about which rounds you selected out of the 6?
yeah,
Okay.
we definitely did editorial and the news program and the commercial, and then our final round was the on the spot.
Okay.
We've done I know that because of space constraints, we could really have prep room, or maybe we did, I don't remember, but we did, this is ice cream for Central, South Central, whatever. We actually did at one of our meetings, we did the breaking news bulletin, newscast, pre-prepared, editorial and on the spot, or editorial and commercial, we eliminated on the spot. And we didn't do on the spot.
We did editorial and commercial and then did not do.
We did not do on the spot, we did breaking news bulletin. Is that yours?
One of ours, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you run finals at that meeting?
No,
Nope.
Okay.
for sure.
Okay.
At some point, we run them all. I mean,
Yeah.
we ran because the Forts was one of the ones before sectionals, so in order to give them that experience,
Sure.
we ran all of those sectional in order. We started at the top, moved all the way down. I think Jim's cut it down the last couple of years to or breaking news, because he had me write a really weird one a couple years ago, aliens over Lake Michigan.
Kids remember that one.
Yeah, I had fun with it. But we do breaking news, usually commercial and editorial, commercial or editorial, news program, and then on the spot, and once in a while, we'll throw in radio program, just so it's practice.
Okay. So if you run, did you guys ever?
Seldom
Not
run
double, right?
We
Yeah.
very seldom run
No
double.
double.
Yeah, that'd be a no double.
And they were all events where they would prep in advance. They would prep it.
Everything was right outside. Okay.
I don't remember offhand what the semifinal event is for sectionals.
Editorial.
Editorial.
Spot, both.
Because I think sometimes we don't run that round because we don't get enough betters to ever do that.
That's right. If you break from prelims to finals, the
Yeah.
editorial is the round that goes away.
Right.
Yeah, sectionals.
Yeah, essentially.
Yep. Yes.
I feel in Northeast that there's a lot of, they were asking us to bring prepared materials and not doing a lot of prep at the actual tournament.
Okay. And do they permit doubling at those tournaments?
No.
So not writing on site, not allowing doubling.
I think it's
Okay.
something
Interesting. What's that?
I think it's something simplistic.
What do you guys think about we've now heard kind of a broad spectrum of what's happening around the state. Is there anything we can take away from this? It seems to me like we've got different things going on in different places, and it's, everybody doing what makes sense to them, but it's not necessarily the same thing across the state. I don't know whether that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm curious about impressions.
One of the things, I don't know if you're going to bring it up later, but we've heard this from, I know the Fort Wayne area is complained about it a lot. The On the Spot is the showcase event because of where it's put in that semi-key position for me. Yet it's such an odd radio skill because the radio doesn't actually do that. And so I think that's one of the interesting things to think about, but it is probably the most challenging of the radio skills.
I would throw that out there too, that it used to be, and I think that it's just kind of hung around long enough that we've all said, well, this is the way we've always done it, so let's continue to do it this way. But I just from experience, in 2003, 2004, two F-16s collided in southwest Indiana, and I was on the radio, and my news director called me, and he says I need to be on air immediately. And from the location, he was giving his report. So I think it still happens, but you're right. It's not. It's extremely rare. So right.
I think that's one of those, and I think we should revisit this a little bit when we start to talk about the skills and the tasks that we want to do, and particularly how they match up to what helps bring in the most effective teaching and learning, how it aligns with curriculum, and I mean, I think those considerations exist in addition to, what is best for performance, I guess. I don't know whether that's more or less important, but I think it's worth talking about at least.
And then, like you said, everybody does it a little bit differently. So is it more important for us to take these baseline things and say, let's develop a standard format for most of the meets, like discussion does, or like that everybody kind of tries to follow? And it could be a term of discretion, but everybody tries to follow it, and that way we're on the same page. Or do we just continue to leave it up to each individual tournament to do it differently?
It sounded to me, though, that most invitational tournaments are trying to prepare students for the qualified tournaments.
Yes.
And they're choosing the events that they think students need experience with. And depending on how you're organizing your tournament, making decisions about whether things ought to be prepared in advance or prepared on site. I think that's one of the reasons why we do our prepared round first round. It's just easier. It's 8 o'clock in the morning or whatever. It's the first round. You knew all week that you had to have this 3-minute news brief written, and students can prep for that. And then once the tournament gets kicked in, then you start the prep, half-hour prep for commercial, half-hour prep for editorial in the middle rounds. And then when you want to wrap things up at the end of the tournament so you can get the results out and send people home, you do the quick round like the on the spot. So
I'd like to see the tournaments in our area do more on-site prep. I don't necessarily approve of doing all the prep work ahead of time. I'd like to see it more based on the state model.
At the very least, I think there's been a tournament or two in the Fort Wayne area last year that's tried to allow them to double, but if we keep them sequestered in their own part of the building, separated from everyone else, not doubling, and we run 4 machine gun rounds where everything is pre-prepped, it seems like a waste to put them.
that seems counterintuitive. It seems if you're going to do that, then you then have plenty of time to do
have 8 rounds.
to do doubling. Well, at least you could say if we're not doing prep, well, that's because we're liable to double and not vice versa.
And I think we're getting at the skills and stuff, but the argument there would be in the real world, they wouldn't be pre-preparing, or they wouldn't be writing a lot of the things that they're going to say.
And again,
Or they would have enough. They would have a week to write it before they produced a commercial, or before they. In the real world, that's. So we'll talk about that.
We could do something more NPR style where they're doing like these essay kind of things almost, that they're delivering informational reports or something like that.
Are you going to get the third bullet item here?
what's
I
that?
do have a criticism.
Sure.
It seems that a lot of schools don't have the equipment or technology to actually set up, a microphone with the speaker. And oftentimes you're in a situation where there's some kind of partition.
If you're lucky, there's a partition in some.
Yes, or it could be just the judge is facing north and you're facing south. But I think that's one thing we can encourage schools to do is to, you know, it doesn't take, I mean, most schools have microphones and speakers and it's just one of those little touches, I think, that really helps the event if you actually are using the microphone and the speaker. And that's an important skill, you know, speaking into the microphone in a way that your voice is being amplified correctly. And that's something that kids don't get if they're constantly speaking through a curtain in the opposite direction of the judge.
I would add to the criticism too there is we've had on numerous occasions judges either take off or write at length on a critique sheet that well, we could hear them breathing heavily, or they coughed, or they cleared their throat. Well, in a radio studio, they wouldn't turn their mic on until they were ready to talk. So you got to have a second to kind of get prepared and then do it. So it's, you know, I think that's a criticism that I've always had is like, well, in a real studio, they would hit on, and then you would hear them instead of, you know, they wouldn't just be on.
So allow the student to have the on-off switch on the mic so they can know where to go.
I don't know that that's something that the IHSFA wants to, I mean, because.
Just have to say, maybe we could just recommend it, or
On the roll.
say, that scenario, this would be what we want.
And our school does not have the radio equipment, but
Yeah, that's-
for our meets, we've been able to borrow it from other schools.
Generally, what has happened in central Indiana is we have a couple of teams who have the equipment, and if somebody's gonna host, they'll talk to somebody and share the, you know, just bring it on the bus with us and set up and there. So, all right, let's move on here, in the interest of getting going here. Now, just for kind of a refresher, the sanctioned rounds that happen at sectionals and state are the breaking news, commercial, newscast, editorial. On the spot is the final at the sectional meet. That's the second SEM currently at the state meet. Radio program only exists at the state meet as a 5-minute performance with music, lead in, lead out, a couple pre-written commercials, and then a set of news to edit into a 5-minute program. So that's kind of what exists right now. And I mention that because when we consider what those things are, like, okay, all these questions are basically like, okay, what skills are we asking the kids to do? What tasks reflect the skills? What should they be doing if we want to mimic actual real broadcast? What should we be asking them to do when we try to get them to develop skills that are in line with curriculum and productive teaching from and facilitation with the coach? So maybe if we can kind of steer in that direction now a little bit and see where that takes us.
Give you a little history on the last time when they went from all pre-prep and just like the rounds were over within 10 minutes to what we're doing now is we sat down with the Indiana State standards from IHSFA and we looked at all the speech standards as far as writing, speaking, analysis, research skills. We looked at everything, and that's where this came from.
Okay.
They were pulled directly from the state standard curriculum.
And radio and television have their own set.
Right. We added to that because it was, the kids for ISTEP take a prompt, write on it. Well, that's what you got for the editorial, you got that for the commercial, but you also have to feed an analysis. You got to take your radio, your television news, bring in the radio copy, how do you edit that down to its pure essence so that you don't waste time and you're choosing the right words. That's what that was about.
That does explain a little bit about why some of the events, like, they don't exactly mimic what happens on air, but the skills were delivered into.
Right. We started with the skill set that you need because there were several of us that did radio or do radio or combination of everything. We had large market, small market, and we all threw our input into it. So we started with this radios and the TV standards, but they weren't really as prominent. They've been redone since the original. We were working from the original state standards that came out, God, 90s, 2000s.
requirements or standards that you were referring to, are those similar to the Indiana academic standards in like English language arts?
No, it's career technical education, so, it's under the it's called like communication arts or something. It's all I teach.
Arts, AD, communication.
Yeah, arts, AD, communication clusters. But it literally is more now it's become more production, and it's become more on-air personality and career focused on basically the production side. Can you sit in a studio and produce other than can you get on a microphone and perform?
Radio and television, 1 and 2.
Yes. One more TV. One of them was more TV, one was more radio.
So, knowing that the skills for what exists right now were largely pulled from standards that existed back in, whenever, the late 90s or 2000s when the event was kind of rejiggered. Like, I think part of the discussion going forward is, because right now, all right, your breaking news is a cold read, obviously. Okay, your commercial is salesmanship, propaganda, persuasion, that sort of thing. Your newscast is editing and synthesis, I guess. Your editorial is crafting an argument and everything that's itinerant in that. Your OTS is, can you crap your pants and keep going, I guess.
It's the impromptu round. It's the
Yeah, it
impromptu
is.
round.
It is, exactly. It's the impromptu round.
Yes,
of radio.
yes.
And your news program, again, is a, synthesis and, type of event. Like, are those, listen to me, like, are those, do we have any thoughts on what those skills are and whether we are matching what's still important for our standards versus what's real for a broadcasting scenario?
I guess is writing still.
They redid the standards in 2014, so it probably won't work out.
Yeah.
Common Core
I'm looking
They've
at
been redone 3 times since I became a radio.
I'm looking at it right now, they're different.
This might not be the right place for it, but, in the idea of getting kids more time speaking and working in prepared material but still maintaining the skill, I wonder about this idea for breaking news section. They have a pre-prepared material of their choice, their own newscast they've prepared ahead of time. And then at some point in that amount of time, let's say it's 5 minutes, they prepare ahead of time 5 minutes up. At some point at a designated mark, you hand them something that is breaking. They then have to adjust on the fly within their already worked 5 minutes, and you give them 2 minutes to adjust. So
I would say
Charlotte used to do that some at Plymouth at some of her meets. I remember back when.
but I think that fits more of the breaking. I've never worked in a radio, but I think that fits more than just the flat out.
I mean, it's not going to happen during the news program. The odds of it happening during a news program are slim. But I mean, you could do it during their radio program. And then call it. But I don't know what you would call it, because then they would have to prepare 2 radio programs, and then one of them you're going to interject the breaking news into.
But it's the idea of having something prepared, but also something
That disrupts.
disrupts. So it's not just the coach working with them ahead of time.
And understanding too the idea of, changing to a solemn, the change in mood and accurately conveying, the seriousness of what's going on too.
Seems to me that in the breaking news copy, that sometimes it's a bit of a gotcha. There'll be an unusually foreign name or location or something of that to kind of test to see if students are paying attention to the news. Are they up on current events? Do they know how to pronounce these particular words or what have you? So I think that there's a bit of that in that gotcha in that breaking news event.
Do you feel like we should keep that? Because you're right, there is a lot of that.
I think so, because it makes them more well-rounded. They're being forced to pay a little more attention the week before the contest to current events and to what's going on. I don't think it's too much to ask for our students to say, hey, one afternoon, just catch up on some news. Know what's going on in the Mideast, in the Middle East. Know what's going on with your upcoming elections. Learn how to pronounce some of the candidates' names. It was amazing to me last year. I judged around, and the question was about Linda Ritz, and I had 3 speeches on Ritz crackers. No one knew who she was. True story. I was appalled. No one knew who she was. And that was in Indiana, high school students that most of them had teachers as coaches. So I don't think it's too much to ask for them to pay a little attention to the world around them at this age.
I guess I would say that, reading the cold copy is an important skill, but I would rather see an impromptu topic like, an event that's been happening in the last week, Linda Ritz, versus by Pence, or the Indiana State Department of Education or School Board, or some other event, what's happened here in the last week that would be important that they would stand out. And just give them some prep time to put together a 1 minute, their own breaking bulletin, their own story. I know the on the spot is more of the way I think of that is it's more of a sensory description, kind of an imagery. This is what I see, this is what I hear, this is what I smell, and then trying to mimic or simulate that experience. Like, right before I came on the air, I had an interview with the fire chief. He told me this about the fire, or whatever. We try to play with that kind of thing too. But maybe make breaking news a bit more of an impromptu type of event, and then it would test students.
I guess when I talk to Joe and when I talk to some other people about this event so much, and it's one I'm obviously passionate about and care about, but it's one I've lived for a long time. So ever since I was a freshman in high school, I've been on the radio, and I built a radio station, and there are just so many things that I think about. But my only concern is to prepare the kids for a real world. And if there is breaking news, the odds of them having to type something up or prepare something and go on with it are pretty slim. Most of the time, the news director is going to run down the hallway and give you something he's already prepared or written, and he's going to have in parentheses a pronunciation, like the correct pronunciation, so the on-air talent doesn't have to worry about saying Fallujah wrong or those types of things. So there is a pronunciation inside of.
I guess I'm thinking more of the talking head news shows that are all over the table that the kids probably have more experience with. Is, well, let's just throw out a topic and then everyone go around the table and give me your 2 cents worth.
Right.
And I imagine some DJs or radio personalities, they're commenting on people putting things on Twitter or whatever. They're doing some kind of freestyling. I imagine
Right.
there's some.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Some independence there, things. So.
Maybe one thing that we could consider when we start talking about making some of these things a little more impromptu is, since we're not dealing with a large segment of the tournament, what if we try to encourage local tournament hosts to give the kids in the prep room internet access while they're, give them a topic like Linda Ritz running for governor. You've got half an hour to craft.
Google, yes.
Yeah. So, it's not, it takes away a little bit of that gotcha element, like who is Linda Ritz, but it also requires them to use some research skills to sort of craft what they're going to say to the radio.
It's an interesting idea too. Any last words about this before we move on here? Yes?
Might there be a way that we could, and this is really kind of thinking outside the box here, where you have some kind of cooperative element between the contestants on air?
I think
Like a crossfire or
Maybe a crossfire or just like banter that you hear on morning radio. Or an interview.
once upon a time when I was a young coach, I sat down, as young coaches do, and designed some wild harebrained idea I was like to do on radio which I think is an interesting idea. I don't know how, it's not a bad idea. I don't know what the paradigm would be for what that interaction would be and how you would evaluate the two people if they're working in conjunction with each other.
That also then creates a nightmare for the people that don't have equipment. Then you're having to provide an extra microphone.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea.
But it is, yeah.
Maybe you think of Mike and Mike, right, on the radio, Mike and Mike, yes. Sports.
Okay, simply put here, like, I mean, ignore this. How important is it for them to write on site versus how important is it, or, you know, what's the argument here? Like, should they be writing on site, or is it okay for them to prepare and bring stuff with them?
I like the idea that there is at least some writing on site at some level, because you worry about, can they do it without the coach? Okay? And so like where I've thought of the doubling aspect is I've liked the idea that maybe it's prep for the prelims, but then we separate out in the elims who was just the well coached versus the really talented. But I think there should be some on-site element, so it's not just a rehearsed coach worked with kid.
But I think too, though, that this is there is nice journalistic writing overlap going on here, and journalistic writing is editorial writing, and it's writing that is engaged in the editorial process. And when you're writing on site, you're editing your own copy, but there's no one else editing your copy. So I mean, if you're a kid and you're putting together a newscast in your practice during the week, or you're putting something together during you're preparing something, the editorial process can take place there, and which really does a good job of mirroring what actually goes on in radio journalism and in other forms of journalism where you're constantly going through your copy. And so I think that, yeah, we need to balance it, but I don't think we should go all one way or all another. And I think what we're doing, I think what we've done is with some of the things that we already have in place is that we've struck that balance. And so I think that some on-site writing, yes, is necessary, you know, I mean, but I also am strongly in favor of the editorial process when it comes to it. You know, we teach our college writers, when I work with college writers, we teach our college writers that, you know, they're writing in a different language. We're teaching our radio contestants that they're writing in a different language than, say, someone preparing an Olympics or someone preparing a case, or where, you know, they're writing in a different way. And so I think we should be able to, you know, our event, if we're going to continue to maintain this event, we need to be sure that we're still making those differentiations.
In a sense, with the commercial and editorial, for instance, you know, they're given the facts, they're given the basis of the issue, whether it's, you know, a print ad that they're then manipulating and turning into a live radio ad, or if it's editorial where they're given both sides, the basic facts of both sides, pro and con of a topic. So I don't think that's really unreasonable. You get a half hour, you got the basic premise of what you're supposed to be talking about. You're just making decisions. What am I going to include? What am I going to exclude? How am I going to organize it? How am I going to make it sound good on the radio? So
are you arguing for?
I think
on-site prep?
that I agree. I think we need to have some prep. There needs to be some events. Maybe not all of them. Maybe we can decide that some events could be, you know, pre-prepped, pre-prepared, but I think there still needs to be that element in this event where the students have to do it on demand. Because they're being asked to do that frequently.
I think the biggest question for me is this event I mean, obviously it's hitting a lot of points, but is this event just strictly an on-air talent? Because if you were just strictly an on-air talent, the odds of you writing a commercial, I mean, the odds of you writing an editorial is probably 150 times %. You know, if you're a Sean Hannity of the world, you're probably writing most of that, or with a script writer, editing that. A commercial, salesperson, business owner is going to write that. News copy, your news director is going to write that. So that's I guess that's where I stand. That most of the writing is done over a course of a period of time, and not just 30 minutes on the spot. So
I think that's a good point, but
honestly, what I hear, all of those comments are kind of saying the same thing, that we like the blend of both things, because there is value in, one, working with an editor and talking about ideas and being able to give a little more polish and have the guidance of an adult to learn some of those skills. But it's also valuable to, like, you know, gets right down to it, you gotta be able to get the job done.
But we're also
And-
assuming that it's that kid's right.
Well, that is the X factor, but.
When you do it on site, you know it's that kid's right.
That's right.
But you have the same question with oratory
Yes.
and
Oratory,
RE.
yes.
That, how do you know it's theirs? Well, there's a,
Yep.
there's a trust there.
Yep. And I think if you start going down that road where we start to put concern about whether it's the kid's writing or not front and center, then we're not trusting people to act as professionals in ethics.
With the on-site writing, I mean, I wouldn't
Yeah.
expect a kid to write an OO in 30 minutes. I think it's acceptable to have a kid write a commercial in 30 minutes.
If it's a product that they're somewhat familiar with.
If they had access to the internet.
Yeah, well, we did a print ad for the new Samsung cell phone model. You know, all kids know something about cell phones. The year before that, it was an Amazon Fire, you know, so we try to pick products and services that kids have some information about and really have some experience with, so they can use that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, I don't want to call it the elephant in the room, but like, I mean, doubling is the forever debate when it comes to radio. And I'm really interested in hearing about people's experiences with, I mean, one, do you think they should be able to, number one? Number two, does anybody, anecdotal evidence only goes so far, but I think it's part of the discussion. I mean, you have kids that you've steered toward other events because you want them to be able to do 2 events, or, you know, have you seen talented kids who leave radio because they really want to, I mean, I think that needs to be part of the discussion.
And this is not meant to damper or end that discussion in any capacity. There's a lot of questions Joe just put in there. I'm very early getting through the surveys. The question was raised, I believe that we should allow radio contestants to double a state, even if it means the prelims are based on materials that students have prepared ahead of time. There's 15 yeses to that and 2 no's. Now, that's very early in the survey process. It could change, and on the board, we'll talk about it, that type of stuff.
It's also quite possible that if we change radio in a way that makes it a lot more interesting and a lot more engaging, that will change your opinion about whether it's a tragedy that they can't double. But if they're doing a lot of really great stuff that takes a lot of the day in regular invitational tournaments in radio, I don't feel nearly as bad having them in their own separate tournaments doing that stuff. But if they're really quickly running through the things that we do in East Indiana, and that's all they do all day.
I compare radio to X-Step. I mean, here at the same prep time, actually the speaking time is shorter than X-Step, and yet we allow doubling in X-Step. So I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me that we're not allowing doubling in radio when it's basically the same format as X-Step.
I am for doubling. I've had numerous occasions where I've had really good kids in radio. They also get really good at something else, and I had to steer them away from it.
I think the
And
reason
that pained me every time.
I think the reason why some tournaments explain why they can't allow doubling is because they've got that phenomenon where they want the same judge to judge more than one section of radio. So you don't know how to stagger or get that double entry to work if you don't know whether you're in the first flight to go or the second flight to go. And maybe we just need to say, use more judges in radio when there's pretty much the other guys now.
I know the circuit that me and Matt run, we've, over the last year or so, we have allowed doubling has kind of become the norm for radio, so.
I think too that we're, the other issue really, again, we've already talked a little bit about it, is questioning the prep. And that gets in the way of then being able to successfully double. I mean, you could flight the tournament, but if you're going to flight to accommodate, say, doubling in discussion in radio, we've all been in tournaments and a lot of tablets tournaments where you're trying, where you're holding on, you're holding on the same stuff, you're waiting on the same stuff, your judge shows up in the wrong place, are you in an A flight or a B flight, all this different stuff, and we're sequestering these students to prep for these events, and it accounts to 1 hour of prep for a grand total, I believe, usually 3 to 4 minutes of actual talk. And so I think and so at least if they're doubling, they can get some help point somewhere else, they can do something somewhere else, they can tap into a different outlet, and I think that's something, that is part of the reason I think that Chris is going to find that there's going to be more than 15 yeses, and there's probably not going to be much more than 2 more no's.
I do want to say that, like, I'm a data guy, so like, I think we should make most of our decisions, like, if you don't have data, we're just sort of lobbing opinions at each other. And I think the opinions have a place in the discussion, but I think, we could look at SpeechWire too and see how many kids over the years have, maybe been really good in radio when they're juniors and don't do it when they're seniors, et cetera. So, I have a strong suspicion what we will discover, but I do think it needs to be based on both things. The ideas that we are having here and that I think many others share in addition to what does the data tell us.
Just a general question, do most tournaments that allow doubling the radio have the contestants do the radio event first and then go to their second event? That's how we do it. That seems to work fine, and that's how they do it next step for most part. The judge sitting there waiting for the radio contestant to come in and do the second event just has to be patient. And as far as the sharing a judge, well, you could easily stagger the prep time 15 minutes, and you could have that way they could judge two rounds of radio, because you're talking like breaking news, it's a 1 minute copy, commercials 2 minutes, editorials 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, you get through a whole round in
Would you be able to
15 or 20 minutes, you're done with your whole round.
Would you be able to guarantee that the double enter contestants in radio are the first flights each round? I think that's the danger.
And you could also learn like to do an impromptu. Excuse me, in that study, you could say there's only certain events, you can double it, non-duo events, etc., so that again, you'll have that continuity, and those judges of the OO round and the impromptu round know that they're waiting for the stampers or the broadcasters to come in for the second event.
Do we have anybody in here who is anti-doubling and willing to say so? How come?
It's not real world.
Are you anti-doubling for all of speech or just for the radio?
I'm anti-doubling, period. I think if we're gonna tell kids, it's wonderful, you're talented, you can do multiple things, you cannot do them at the same time in any job situation. You have to manipulate your time to, yes, if you're working 2 part-time jobs, you don't do them at the same time. No boss is gonna allow that. You're gonna have to choose. I don't see the difference.
But if our goal is to give kids more opportunities, I might
Now,
come
is it
back to
our
that.
goal to give the kids the opportunity, or is it to give the coaches the opportunity? That's my biggest question. And I
Well,
think
yeah,
that's
that's
fair.
That's a good point.
So, do the kids always want to push the limit and the envelope and double? Or do the coaches go, hey, you're really good at this, let's put this in here too, you can double every, you'll get more points, and by the way, so will I.
Right, the sweepstakes, yeah,
Yeah.
we'll do a little bit of that.
Okay, so, and that's just me.
Right.
But I have never understood why people want to double. It's double the headaches, double the heartache sometimes, and it really does not prepare you for a whole lot of reality.
But I guess if we're talking about kids only speaking for 14 minutes at a particular tournament, then they're just sitting around doing nothing.
That was one of the other considerations to doing more
Right.
on-site prep.
It's a fair point. No, it's a fair point. I mean, anybody else?
I would just say with radio that when I have a talented student that doesn't really seem to fit in anywhere else, radio usually works because it has a lot of variety within the event itself, all the different events, and that you know, for the creative kid, wow, I can do this second round, I can do something totally different the second round, something totally different the third round, and they like that. So it really fits for certain kids that maybe, you know, don't fit in other events.
I'm afraid I'm probably repeating myself a little bit, but if we didn't double, but we instead increased the number of different rounds that we had in radio tournaments, that might decrease the motivation or the interest in trying to double. If you have a person that really likes the different variety of rounds that you've got, and we have like an 8-round tournament in radio while everyone else is just doing 4, actually we can eliminate some of that pressure and try to find something more for them to do over the course of the day. It takes place from sweepstakes points still, but it's a lot easier to tell a kid, yeah, I'm going to take you to radio, only radio. Because I know that you'll be busy, you'll be doing something.
Yeah.
Joe, do we have the previous radio topics, you know, scripts for breaking news, the cuttings for the news programs?
I got
somewhere
this.
online.
Last year, I
Coaches can
asked
use that.
Regina and received a Bill Hicksian type repository from Charlotte of old radio prompts, which the radio committee last year used those to help as models for last year's prompts. So, Wally, the answer to your question is yes, we do have some of that. And I'm guessing your next question is, can we make that available?
That is my next question. You know, last year's sectional and state topics, why didn't we just throw them up there on the website? And that way, you know, hey, show coaches exactly, this is what your tester can be asked to do. So, you know, I think it would be a great help.
So, I showed you a little while ago what the different event, or, you know, the rounds are at the state tournament, and it's informative, I think, to look at how long kids are actually saying words out loud. And you can look at those numbers up there, and those roughly translate into, if you talk in for the first 3 rounds, you are speaking out loud for 5 minutes. If you break to the 2 sets, you get 9 minutes. If you talk for the whole day, you get 14 minutes of total speaking time. Versus impromptu being our next shortest event, you can see the times there for prelims plus SEM, finals. There's extemp also, and the 10-minute events down below. And it's a given that discussion is kind of its own separate piece. So that's pretty stark.
That's one of the challenges of radio, that every second counts, every word counts, every pronunciation,
It's
enunciation counts.
never the same twice. You're looking at other events, those are memorized, right?
Right.
For the most part, you're giving the exact same speech every week. There's a big difference.
Though with impromptu and extemp, we're still talking about, what, 3 times as much for extemp as, now, you know, maybe only draw twice. Well, no, at state they draw every round, don't they?
And I still heard speeches, which isn't supposed to happen.
So, I mean, you do have a point there with, you know, with the memorized events or the prepared events, like that's the same thing every time. And there is something to be said for the mental gymnastics you have to go through prepared. But still, I mean, that's pretty brutal to look at in print there. So, what, if any, ideas do you have going forward? Like if the entire radio committee were sitting in here or the board was sitting in here, what would you tell them? Like, if we want to save the event, and I'm guessing you all do since you're here in this room at, you know, 4 o'clock, almost 5 o'clock now on Saturday, what do we tell the decision makers needs to happen going forward?
Joe, do you think this event is in jeopardy, being eliminated?
It is in, I can say unequivocally, it is in the discussion, or it is in the discussion of the events that could potentially be retracted.
Why do you think that is?
It doesn't matter.
I can't speculate on that,
Ken?
but I think it probably has to do with a lot of the things we talked about today.
What are the numbers?
Meaning,
like sectional entries, where does it line?
okay, now I'm working from memory here a little bit. I started, okay,
I guess I'm.
you have to take this with a big grain of salt.
Is the
Okay.
danger because of lack of participation?
Participation has been falling in my part of the state in the sectionals that I have gone to. Okay, it has been falling. Maybe some others can speak to historical trends from your areas of the state too.
I think the last
Jeff-
2 years.
Jeff, what have you guys been seeing up into?
It is one of the smaller events at sectionals, like across the state.
But that's going to be an artificial comparison simply because we don't know what doubling.
I feel like doubling.
If we allow them to double, then the
Yeah.
number would probably explode.
Well, and the numbers aren't exactly the same as they used to be either because we had a rejiggering of the sectionals, however many years ago that was, not too long ago. But general trend, I've noticed it going down in my part of the state.
And I think you're right, Chris, I think it's become a victim of not being able to double in this thing.
Well, we had that with extemp and impromptu, when they weren't allowed to double. Extemp's numbers got terrible. When we put doubling back in, they both went up because they shared the same people. I would definitely like to see the amount of time speaking get put up higher.
Well, what are you talking on an impromptu, around 5 to 7 minute speech?
Yeah, I don't think every event has to be 5 or 7 minutes. There could be a short event, but it should be balanced out with something longer.
Especially like if you do something pre-prepared, that could be longer, because they definitely have the time to do that. You get into the script writing, the editorial process, and they have that time. But then you can do the on-site prep can be the 1 to 2 minute, and then their total time is still longer.
Or if we allowed electronic retrieval in the prep rounds, where students could do their research on
Well,
topics.
I would tell you that's going to be difficult to do because of school policies. The electronic, well, unless you had it downloaded, or if you're
They
trying
wouldn't
to.
necessarily have to have the internet.
You open
Yeah.
up a big can of worms
Well,
there because
We're
the
allowing in
internet.
that step, right? I mean,
Huh?
we're allowing electronic retrieval in that step.
I'm sorry, I thought you meant like
Not
internet
access.
connection.
Right
Yeah,
now,
okay.
I think
Then my bad.
you'd have to do electronic, you couldn't do
Yeah.
internet access.
I thought you were referring to internet access.
Oh,
Just
I
because-
guess I was referring to internet access.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I mean,
I guess we still have.
there's no,
You're not
like,
telling me that we, this.
you don't have internet access for extemp prep, you better not. I mean, that's
No,
illegal.
it all has to be on a flash
It
drive.
has to be offline.
You're saying that there's still schools in this state that don't have internet access?
No, I'm saying there's no way in God's green earth my school would ever allow me to let students from other
There's no
school.
way. there's
They
no
won't even
IT
let my
company
students
that
get
would
on
let
the,
Okay,
on the
so you-
Wi-Fi.
You don't have
access.
a guest Wi-Fi or guest
Oh,
sign?
it's there, it just doesn't
Our
work.
school doesn't.
Nope, it's intentional. They don't want, because of liability, there's no way they would
It's
ever.
liability.
Yeah,
Well, then what if we said, okay, for the breaking news, my idea earlier brainstorming was, let's just pick a topic it's hot that week. And then students could do their research and they could store electronically and they could bring that with them on a
right.
laptop. or
It was offline, which is
Use
what
that during the event.
the debate rules and the extemp rules are.
But you'd have to release the topic, in advance, of course, like you do for other events.
The only concern I have with making events longer in real world is a person doing a newscast on a local radio station is not gonna be on there for 5 minutes. It's gonna be quick, it's gonna be 1.5, 2 minutes long.
But you could still keep the newscast, short and then do like an editorial on EPR. It's their research story. That's and that
That is
actually pulls-
15 minutes long.
Well, I wouldn't say 15,
Right.
but like further out, it could be a 5-minute story.
Right.
And they've done their research, and that's actually another skill set. The storytelling and the scripting.
there's nothing that prevent, if the event is going to be redesigned also, there's nothing that prevents combining some of the rounds that exist now together into the pre-prepared material that is brought to the tournament. So you could conceivably have a student write music, intro, outro, newscast, commercial, and mash all that up into one 5-minute performance. I mean, there's nothing preventing.
Like the culmination of the day, right? Each event is leading and adding to this final program that you just synthesize all of your previous events into a.
And that leads us into something that the Rules Committee has worked on a little bit. And I wanted to bring this up last because I didn't want this to color the opinions that you gave. But there has been some work done on this already. And the idea is that the model that they've sketched out would be along the lines of, okay, we're going to release music copy and commercial in whatever format that would be on Monday. And much like discussion, you would have all week to get that stuff prepared. Your news copy would then be released Friday morning, and you'd have that last day to edit that down and put all of that together into a 5-minute program. Which then you would use to compete for those first 3 rounds. That's kind of what Chris was alluding to, and Josh earlier, was that, you know, that longer for the 5 round, for the first 3 rounds, and then if you, and we're moving to quarterfinals, 24 kids to quarters, and then 12 kids to sems now. So the 24 that break the quarters would then do the editorial largely as it exists now. The sems, you know, the OTS is still our, you know, kind of a bell horse or whatever you want to call it. So that would be your sem, and then the final would be taking some of the stuff that you've already written and brought to the tournament and written at the tournament and adding that along with a new set of news copy for a prep and then a final performance of whatever length that would be.
I really like
Aaron,
that.
and then Jeff.
Yeah, so just to be clear, the news program would be like humor is the same first, second, third round. You do the same news program first, second, third round.
Correct.
In that proposal. Okay.
In this proposal, that is what that would be, yeah. Jeff?
That was my question, but I'll add on to it then. So then you're saying the final round would be still using the information they already brought, or would it be like we do it?
The final round would be using the commercial that they have prepared and brought, using the music copy that they have brought with them. The editorial that they wrote in the quarterfinals,
and the new set.
And then they would have time to edit down a new set of news copy.
Oh, a news, okay.
All
But
that,
that would still be a 5-minute program, right?
presumably, I can't remember whether rules specified the length on that, but.
And
That
then,
is more realistic.
Yes.
yes, I agree.
That's a-
And then doing this, would this allow them to double a sectional and state tournament?
Rules has sketched out a scenario and looked at the way
Would
we
make sense.
flight the state tournament in a fashion that this would theoretically allow those kids to double.
So at the sectional
All right, now,
tournament,
here's a caveat with that, though. Would potentially allow them to double at state. They do not as yet have it fleshed out for it to work at sectionals.
Yeah, because a lot of sectional heads run their times different.
yeah, but why would it
And
be?
depending on numbers, that depends
That would
on what
make
you're
sense.
doing too, so.
Well, like
I don't see how that
discussion.
would be different than, like Wally said, with the extent prep.
I don't
you
think
come-
it's,
You know, you come prepared for your 3-round prelims. If you're small enough that you don't have a semi,
Right.
you go straight to the final round. I mean, you're gonna, you know, if you have a quarterfinal. Okay.
And I was gonna say, like discussion,
Regardless of whether to Dublin, I like the format.
we released the topics the week before for sectionals, and we released the topics the week before state.
Yeah.
You know, that's 2 sets of ideas and artifacts that have to be created, so it's more work for the committee. But they could do something like this, where they would have a sectional
it's actually
copy,
not as much
they would have
work
a
for,
state copy, you know.
it's actually not as much work for the committee because we're not writing as much of the material. You can simply be providing prompts that the students then do things with.
That final
at
round
school.
is real life,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
100%.
And
I
that
think
brings in the
it makes it
breaking,
much more applicable to real life.
Yes,
brings in the breaking bulletin item with that new set of news copy.
yes.
It's something they
That's
haven't
a
seen
breaking
before,
point.
something
Yeah.
they've got to incorporate into the,
Yeah.
is that final program?
I don't want to editorialize, I like the model.
When does this
think
get
it's-
voted on for whether this is gonna be what we're doing this year?
My guess is, this will probably be part of the discussions with council after
Okay.
everybody else goes home.
My only.
I don't know that we're voting on anything today. I think it's definitely probably going to come up at the January meeting.
That would be my only concern. I'm not a big fan of making rule changes halfway through the season,
No.
and then all of a sudden, oh, by the way, in 3 weeks, this is what your rules. So my encouragement to those board members who are in the room would be to maybe not necessarily vote on this today, but make it before the season starts, the first
If we're going
November.
to do it this year.
If you're gonna do it this year, if you want, like with this, whatever changes, make those changes via Google Hangout or whatever, and the vote, and get it disseminated and communicated to us before the season starts, so that as a tournament host, then I can offer this option, to prepare students. I don't like when rules are changed in January meeting, because then,
We went down that road
Yeah.
discussion a couple of years ago.
Right.
and we
So
don't
anyway.
want to do that.
that would just be my request as a coach.
Did you make note of that? That will be communicated to the room.
You can use my name if you want.
One other thing, and, not to, I don't want to throw anything in your, whatever, but, something that I think the kids might like, as an option is a sportscast, just as itself or around a sportscast. I know a lot of, especially the boys, like, really, enjoy something like that. Even it could be, like they're reporting on a game that's happening, they could say, here's an update on the scores, and then we get back to the game. It could be like a 3-minute, for one of the, breakdowns.
That's a good idea. You could even, we have concerns about that appealing for girls, you could just call it something like soft news, and it could be,
Entertainment.
Should be a celebrity gossip or whatever.
In my presentation. I'm worried right now.
Ardent feminist when it comes to.
No, I know, hey, I have two
education,
girls,
it's-
I have two girls, but, yeah.
When it comes to education.
And you just see more and more female broadcasters,
Yes.
sports broadcasters all the
We've
time.
got someone who just made it,
Yeah.
she's on ESPN now, it's one of our former students, and she
Girls
is,
just got added to baseball tonight, so they.
Stephanie's been doing an awesome job, so we're real happy for her.
Okay, let me ask you two pointed questions here. One, first I'll say this is not a done deal at this point. There has to be a board vote and considerations of the best way to move forward. However, that's the most work that's been done to date. Is there anything up there that says, no, screech, stop? The next question, just interrupt, and I forgot what my next debate point was. Inter makes you dumber. Oh, no, seriously, I can't remember what I was just gonna ask.
So this is not a done deal, it's gotta go through board approval.
Is there anything
I
up
know, I know.
Are we going to bag sectional and state, or are we going to do different rounds like we
A
do
very
now?
pointed
section
question to
state?
ask.
I know.
Which one would you eliminate for sectionals?
Oh, I remember now. If it came down to a choice between something like this and killing the event. I mean, if it comes down to a question of, we need to revamp of the event, or we're going to likely kill the event.
I think it's
Both.
good.
We need to revamp and allow them.
And a lot of,
Okay. Okay.
And which of these events did you recommend eliminating for sectionals?
Yeah, that needs to be.
Would it be like 2 news programs, and then maybe the third prelim would be
I don't know.
editorial?
I don't know. You're going to be in the room in a little bit.
Yeah,
so
but I mean, I'm
you
just
can-
trying to get people's feelings on it. If you were going to eliminate
One for sectionals, which one would you
Why
eliminate?
On
would
the
you
spot.
have to eliminate one section?
because there's one fewer round in sectionals than.
Yeah, it'd be fewer rounds.
And also, if you don't have enough competitors, you go straight to finals, so you maybe.
Well,
The
If
upside is that final
you
can
followed
scoop
the
up
current
lots.
practice, you would,
Yeah.
the final for state would not be a sectionals, right? The current practice would be, you do the
You
three
would enter those,
prelims, your
yes.
semifinal, if you had one, would be the
Yeah.
editorial, and your final round would be on the spot.
So the editorial would be the optional round if you went straight to finals.
Correct.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
If you follow,
use
if
program
you follow the
current
current
models
format.
follow.
Like,
So it's
the
basically the same as it is today.
Yeah.
the only difference is instead of prepping at sectionals, you get the stuff to prep early, which would allow, potentially allow more. I like the new format,
I want,
very much.
any last comments? I have exceeded the amount of time that I was allotted, so
Kudos.
thank you.